everyone, welcome. We're so happy you're here to share with us this exhibition and the panel discussion. I will let Yuval do the introductions, but I'll just say about this show that where I think Yuval made a very interesting and significant contribution to the history of looking at collage in general is that I think he took the idiom, the Barras idiom that form follows function, and broke it apart. So this show really looks at the function of collage in its many different forms.
I thought I had a really great moment today when I remembered, Woody Allen's Annie Hall, which was done in the same year as a lot of the works in this room, exactly. And I was thinking about this scene where he's standing in the queue waiting for the cinema, and he hears this professor talking in the back about Marshall McLuhan, and he goes on in so much detail about his theory, and Woody Allen's so annoyed by it, and then at some point he says, you know nothing of his work, and I'll prove it to you, and he calls Marshall McLuhan, the actual theorist, he grabs him from behind this post that advertises films, and he brings him into the room to actually tell this guy, well, you know nothing of my work. And I actually thought I got this amazing gift like Woody Allen today, that I actually have the three people I would like to be sitting with and talking about this exhibition. Ones I would pull from behind my screen, so I'm really grateful for the three of you for coming here today. This exhibition is unusual in the sense that it's the result of a very long research process. It started with my doctoral thesis work on the legacies of the medium of collage to maybe the time we're living in today. And one of the big questions that emerged very early on when I started this process was actually noticing that that most histories of collage end in the 1970s for one reason or another. And partly also because history does need some time to digest often more than other disciplines. But the great thing was to notice that really something big happens in that moment in the late 1970s, whether it's technologically speaking about the introduction of personal computers or the changes in television habits or advertising, which is one sort of argument people go by, whether it's this so-called postmodernist moment where everything becomes available to all of us to pick and take and use and make and all these sort of different aspects, but it seems that clearly there's a moment there, and some people would say this is the best moment collage as a medium has ever experienced, and others might say that this is maybe the demise of what was an art form and then became something that we all do every day with our iPhones. So instead of using very contemporary examples of people who are already completely immersed within that digital form of art making and so on, the decision was to return to two historical moments that were very, very jarring. The first is the so-called invention of collage, its early roots with artists like Picasso and Braque and the beginnings of the 20th century. And the other point this exhibition is really dealing with is that moment in the 70s and the 80s and its legacy thereafter on the use of found photographic materials and other kinds of materials. And the artists who are included in that category and who have been incredibly generous in their relationship with this exhibition have, I think, really, really tested the medium and pushed it to its very limits. So as many people have remarked already in the exhibition, many of the works here are not collages by their strict definition. And I really hope you all get a chance to, if you haven't, to come see the show when it's with the films running and with the vitrines in the center of the space, because I think it's important to it. But there's something about this pushing of medium, or media in general, towards its ends or its edges, led for this idea of the ends of collage. Whether it's the historical ends, these two moments, whether it's the idea of an end as a place where collage happens, maybe not as a technical procedure, but as an event, something that happens when one picture ends and it meets another place, another context, another image or so on. And whether the idea of ends is really thinking about what are the ends, what are the goals of this medium, rather than how it looks like and how are we used to entering a gallery and what we expect when we hear collage. And I think that in that sense, this is, I'll introduce briefly, although I'm not sure this is needed, the speakers who are joining here today. David Campany is a writer, curator, and artist. His most recent project, A Handful of Dust, takes the form of both a book and an exhibition. It follows the footsteps of a photograph by Man Ray depicting Marcel Duchamp's large glass. Campany is also a specialist in photography and film and a lecturer at Westminster University in London. John Stezaker is known for his work with found photographic materials by means of collage, silkscreen printing, and filmmaking. His work is primarily produced using film still photographs, portraits of film stars, and postcards. John was recently invited to curate an exhibition at Birmingham Museum, which he titled Turning to Sea. The show takes its point of departure from a self-portrait by Van Dyck from 1640 and includes works from Rembrandt through Picasso to the present day. As both an artist and a musician, Linder is equally known for her involvement with the punk movement, with radical feminism, and for the way her artistic and political interests include and inform each other. Linder's photomontages also have been equally used for music album covers, self-published zines, as well as museums and galleries. In recent years, Linder has been working more and more with performance. She recently created a ballet piece titled Children of the Mantic Stain, with choreographer Kenneth Tyndall, a score by Maxwell Sterling, and performed by Northern Ballet dancers at the Royal Festival Hall in London. So maybe we start with a personal question to John and Linder as very well-known collage artists. And what led you to start with this medium, or to start engaging with collage to begin with?
Boredom. I think from being a very, very young child, I'd always drawn and painted quite obsessively at times. I mean, there was very little on television to distract in the 1950s, 60s, etc. And then I went to art school in 1974, and again, we were encouraged to draw, paint, make marks, when you're sleeping on the toilet, when you're eating, to always be making some sort of marks on paper, trying to grasp a moment. And so by the summer holidays between my second and final year, I just had enough of mark making. I was so tired of, I suppose, the palette I had. So it was a glorious moment when I just cleared everything away that could make any kind of a mark. And I started to work with surgeon's scalpels, which are far more subtractive. And I was cutting on glass, because we cut on glass rather like ice skating. The scalpel moves very beautifully. It's almost like drawing, but you're subtracting all the time. So in a way, it was in a very punk fashion, perhaps. It was through boredom, and also through great curiosity about working with a found image rather than creating an image on a blank page, to limit oneself purely to the found image. So in one word, I suppose it was boredom.
And was that something that emerged from, do you think, was that done in relation to historical sort of precedents, or was that something you felt was just actually getting outside the box and being more free from maybe a history of art, or what was done before?
It was, I think it was in the main just personal, just really bored watching my right hand, involved in that sort of, in that mark making. And also I suppose at that point, which would be the summer of 1976, within music, very, very radical changes were happening. So I think that also, rather than looking at art history, looking far more, I suppose, at the very, very contemporary music that was happening around me, which I said was quite short and spiky and pointy, and somehow using a scalpel seemed to fit with the tempo of the times.
John, you had I imagine, a very different starts. I always find you two have this interesting,
Well, I've been bored too. But no, I came to collage through collecting images, really. And for a while, as a child, since we're talking early teens, why not? For a while, in my early teens, I had a collection of postcards and various things, images of sorts. But I didn't really connect that with my desire to make art. It took a few years to sort of filter through as a connection. And I suppose it was pop art. So suddenly becoming aware of pop art in the mid-60s must have made me think, there's a connection here. Found image, art, there is a way of doing it. And I tried all kinds of things, like blowing up small images, but in the end I always found I was making little collages first, and then making terrible mistakes on a large scale as I transposed them, and I didn't like that transfer of scale, and it bugged me. So in the end, it took me nearly a decade from that point onwards to realise actually it's best just to keep to what's already there. And I did find I had a transition at college too, which was very difficult for me to make. I arrived as, I think, quite an accomplished draftsman. I did it. Interesting, I had a connection with drawing too. But I couldn't make the transition between drawing and the instantaneity of drawing, the speed of drawing. And the laborious thing, I couldn't look at a painting for a second day. I would have changed my mind entirely about it. So painting didn't really suit me. And it was only when I found collage that I found a kind of continuum with drawing. So I think there is a connection.
You told me once that you've had an experience with trying to project an image on a wall.
That's exactly where my practice began, if you want to pinpoint a moment.
Yeah.
My father was moving from one job to another, and as a present, they gave him a projector. It's a long story, I'm sure. It's a good story. I'll try and abbreviate it if I can. And we didn't have any slide films or slides of the family at that point. So it came with a ready-made slide, which has Parliament at sunset. And I was trying to kind of make this connection between my found images, postcards and so on, and painting. And so I thought, this is an easy way of blowing it up. So I blew it up on the wall. There's an amazing painting, rather expressionist, I think, at that time. And I thought it was the most marvellous thing ever done until I turned the light on. There's this monstrosity. But I then got obsessed with this particular. I could only do one corner of this slide because it didn't have a zoom on it, this projector. So I could only do Big Ben and sunset. And so that was my first, in a way, found image. Yeah, and I tried all kinds of other ways of enlarging, but I eventually sunk in that actually the collages are best.
When we met last time, we started a conversation. I was telling you very much how interested I was in also the quantitative aspect of images starting to emerge in the 70s and overwhelm us. And you seemed quite disappointed by that argument. And you said immediately, I hear that argument all the time. I'm not sure I'm completely fine what it delivers.
Well, it's a cliche, isn't it, that there are too many images, or we are bombarded by images. Well, for a start, I don't know what the correct number would be. If you were to have a cull and bring it back from too many to an appropriate number, I don't know what that would be. The complaint about there being too many images goes back, at least to the 20s. That first flourishing of what we now call the mass media. Plenty of writers at the time are saying, stop, put the brake on, there's too much. And all of those metaphors about flooding or bombarding were put in play then, nearly 100 years ago. But I never thought it was the quantity that was the issue. I think any one image is too much. Not in the sense that we shouldn't have images, I'm not suggesting that, but images are just wild things, and they're ambiguous things, and they're uncontrollable, and that's or recontrollable, and that's part of the appeal to the collagist. And that would be true if there were only one image in the world. I've never felt bombarded. I've never felt there were too many. It may be to do with the fact that I share a boring childhood with these two, and that
You're really hitting the
the encounter with images was to be welcomed, and I've never looked back. I mean, the thought that there are too many just never crosses my mind.
But do you think that maybe there's a different sort of sensitivity or sensibility that sort of emerged recently towards images?
Yes, but I think one can say that at any point in the history of images, because it's a constantly changing field. But just coming back to McLuhan from your introduction, I mean, McLuhan was wise enough to point out that new communications technologies or new image technologies don't replace old ones. Everything keeps accumulating. But perhaps the newer ones redefine our relation to the old ones and sort of reinvent the old ones somehow. And I suppose you could say that the extraordinary interest in a show like this has something to do with the fact that a certain kind of dematerialisation of the image has alerted people anew to its material manifestations, I think.
The piece we have here by Linder from 1977 is, whenever I take people around and I look at it, I think your work has become so known for a very, very provocative form of imagery, and it's very often taken from the world of pornographic imagery, and often juxtaposed with a domestic sort of environment, kind of either tools or places and food, and it's very jarring in that sense. And I find that that there is an interesting upscaling from this, or also back here now, to this sort of painterly relationship to dance and performance. And I wonder if you feel that even within your own career, there's been some kind of a progress or a change or a certain different exposure to that, to images and how they function.
I suppose it very, very much may depend on one's age. I suppose if you're 10 years of age, growing up in this culture, then everything will be normal. It's only with the luxury of getting, as each decade passing, you have some sense of being able to get some perspective. I tend to be, I don't live in a city. I live near the sea, and I don't have any television, and I don't look at computers very often. So I suppose I manage my consumption. I sort of, have periods of fasting where I don't look at any contemporary imagery whatsoever. I'm coming to London for a few hours. The first few hours seemed just too much visual noise, but that's probably just personal preference. And I suppose over the decades of making photo montage and collage, the accretion, I'm sure it must be the same, just the amount of material that one collects becomes more and more unmanageable. Just the physicality of it, just that many copies of Playboy or that many cake decorating books, it just gets almost unmanageable and slightly nightmarish at times. But then the only way to sort of diminish those stacks is almost just, to get in and open those books and start sort of going back in time. But when I'm working, then I suppose it's almost as much working with time as working with photography, because I end up reading. If it's in Playboy, I'd read the letters page, or if it's in a cake decorating magazine, I'd want to know why suddenly the cakes were like spaceships in the 1960s and cakes like zodiacs, and all those things fascinate me, so I get sidetracked all the time. So I suppose I'm always trying to contextualise the imagery that I work with. It's not purely the image. I also like to know why, whether it's a cake or a certain road, why a rose was given a certain name in 1972, which, they always reflect the time. It's like Superstar that wouldn't have happened in the 1950s, for example. It's a long and rambling answer, and I'm not quite sure where it's going, but I do sort of, like I say, almost fast from contemporary imagery and just retreat into these sort of, stacks and piles of books and magazines that almost threaten to sort of envelop me. So it's a very inconclusive answer.
Is there a reason that led you to actually use so much film stills and postcards as like a real key of your work?
In the 70s, just after I left college, a lot of the cinemas, mainstream cinemas, were closing down. And so these sort of informal archives of film stills and film memorabilia, portraits of film stars, began to filter into the junk shops. And I started becoming fascinated by them. And then there was a moment one day in 1977, I think, 76, when I thought of combining the two, the postcard and the film still, and it was just like magic. Sort of a great moment, which somehow has never kind of gone away while working with that combination. It is strange. I suppose they're both images that are to do with movements. Postcards move through the world and they're telling you about other places. Film stills are records, or supposed records, of movement. And the combination is interesting, both in spatial and temporal terms. But also, the postcards tend to be a little bit older. So the film stills tend, the ones I collect, tend to come from the sort of mid to late 40s. Whereas the postcards tend to be pre-war. So this is like a space that's both behind historically as well as in front.
And does it happen very often that people recognise scenes in these film stills? Are these...
I hope not. I try not to. I do everything to avoid that. I'm trying to liberate them from that. I was interested in what they were saying about the profusion of images, this deluge of images. I don't feel it quite like that either. But I feel more that the problem with images is that they have completely departed into the world of information, so they're completely linked to language. And the job of collage or whatever is to rescue the image from that space. Well, I don't know whether collage is anything more than a tiny friction within what one might call the sort of montage of everyday life through the media. But maybe that's all we're reduced to, but it's some sort of resistance to that, that movement away, disappearance of the image, to try and rescue it as something that appears, is visible. Because most images are invisible because they're consumed at such speed. And I think that's even more important. Profusion is the speed of consumption of images. As I left tonight, my son was in the bedroom upstairs and he was on his iPhone, and behind him was flickering another computer. And there was another one behind that. I thought, it's just impossible. I understand that feeling of deluge. But in a way, it's how you control those channels, or those readings. There's never a point where you can rescue the image from it. And oddly, I find myself in very similar circumstances to Linder. I tend not to watch TV. We do have one, but try and avoid the media as much as possible. Maybe we're becoming sort of like desert saints of media culture, you and I.
Can only hope.
Yes.
John, can I ask, so when you are making a collage photo montage, how long do you contemplate the found imagery for? I mean, it varies, but...
Yes, I mean, how can you say that? I mean, when I see an image that I know I really want, there's something that happens which is absolutely indescribable. Mm-hmm. But that doesn't happen too often, unfortunately. Mm-hmm. Less and less, I find. And then when I see a combination between that and something else, mm-hmm. I mean, that's perfection. It doesn't happen too often either. Mm-hmm. I find my practice is both very, very fast and incredibly slow. Mm-hmm. So an idea I have, a combination between one image and another, say, that happens, I think, yeah, okay, I'll keep it like that for a while. It's not quite working. And then it sort of usually has to be a period in between. And then I come back to it. Uh-huh. Or it might be even at the press of dismantling because it's a failure, that suddenly something happens. Mm-hmm. And then that goes on hold for us, just in case. And then there's another year elapses. So it can go on like that. Some of these things I've been working on for years.
Do you have to wait to see if it's any good?
Yes, essentially. I'm getting better at it. I usually have to have other people tell me. It's faster if my wife gets involved, for example. She knows exactly what is any good. Now,
just thinking about that question of rescue or redemption, I always think of perhaps there being a difference between the collagists that worked and work with the material of their own time. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I don't know why, but I think of Hannah Hock. Mm-hmm. Those collagists who seem to be interested in imagery from previous epochs, and I suppose Max Ernst's interest in the kind of imagery that you have in Simone de Bonte is it's sort of indicative of that. I mean, it's not really clear cut, but I always get the feeling that that idea of rescuing and redemption has more to do with the latter, has more to do with this sort of delay and then returning to an image or an idiom of images that isn't very current anymore. I think that's very different from the collagist who's very much attuned to the culture in which they're living and is bouncing it back or inverting it or subverting it or whatever it is they're doing, don't you think?
I do, absolutely. And you know exactly which camp I belong to.
But I also think that there's something about, again going back to that moment in time, where I feel like that in the late 1970s, there's suddenly that possibility of maybe rethinking that whole project that was called the avant-garde.
Yeah.
There's some kind of a critical project going on about going back to that moment and rethinking it. I think exactly re-examining what is it this realism was doing again, what is it that so many of these, and yeah, I wonder if that's not part of that shift in that moment, because I'm wondering, previous to that, it seemed to be that the majority of the cases in collage are really expressing something very engaged with the present moment. A very subversive medium, constantly interested in what's happening tomorrow. Again, not constantly, as you say, there are different examples, but there's something that, and I think that's also what that troubles me often, is collage became something almost nostalgic sometimes we feel, or how does it, when does it and when doesn't it? And I don't think that's something it had before that moment, maybe. I don't know. I mean, you definitely know better than I do.
Before the 70s.
Before the 70s, before that, I feel like until there was something. Yeah.
I mean, what about the example that David was talking about, appropriating?
Absolutely, absolutely. But I feel like that with Max Ernst, there's. I'm not. I always get the feeling that maybe his interest was not in the period from which these materials were coming from. Even though he was using them, he seemed to be very mischievous, but also in a way that's not very much considering this. There's something historical about the project.
I'm not sure I agree with that, really.
Yeah.
I think he was very interested in that particular period. The period just before he was born, really. The world.
That's the same for you.
Exactly. Precisely. Which I think is what really got me interested. And taught me that it's possible to be fascinated by images that come from before your time. So it's not nostalgia exactly, because it's not taking you back anywhere to where you know, but it's taking you to somewhere that you never knew. And I think that's their fascination, because they're dead images, they no longer have currency. And so suddenly they become images and not just a representation of something else.
But is there a kind of, when there is this, I was imagining you with your, having turned off the telly and you've got your stacks of old mags and bits, I was kind of caught because I was thinking, I understand that, yes, there's a delay there. Here you are, contemporary flesh and blood now, and then you're looking at this old material, and there must be some kind of, the frisson must be in some kind of clash of consciousnesses between the consciousness of the period in which those images were made and now. But then you spoke in a very verbal way about wanting to sort of get back into that culture. Why did they call roses superstars in 1972? As if you wanted to recover that consciousness rather than just enjoy the clash with the now. Yeah.
But also I do use contemporary imagery. So I think the earliest imagery I use is from the 1920s, and I also use contemporary imagery. And I think using contemporary imagery is almost like a palette refresher. I just really like going into Smith's or wherever and just, I guess it's taking biopsies, I suppose, of the imagery that's around us. Because people, especially young women often say to me, what has changed?
Yeah.
So they're not an awful lot. It may look different, but there's not that much difference. If you look at, say, pornography of the last 20 years, I have a large collection of pornography before that, and there's always some very laboured narrative as to why a woman would suddenly be naked in a forest. They have to sort of, and I'm quite fascinated by those sort of laborious narratives about, the woman suddenly naked encountering the man. But now, of course, contemporary pornography, there's no narrative, there's no costume, there's no room sets. It really is point and shoot in every meaning of the
Post-narrative form.
Yes, it is post-narrative form. So, but the most recent work is of about the last month. I sent you one or two, and it's just taking imagery from every decade. I'm having a really fantastic time of just slamming it all together.
I was about to ask, are these made digitally?
No, they're quite large.
They're not.
So I've begun to take the found page, and normally, rather like John, I work to a very limited scale, but now I'm just sort of doing lots of pages from all different eras, and also using artists like Dali as a found image, just as a found image in a book, and moving that out. So I'm having this fantastic time of just putting images together from the last 6-7 decades. What do you
use Prism?
No, I use a cheap one. It's acid free. It's very silky. What do you use?
I'm not saying.
Flour and water? I don't know. Oh, I love them. They're like lipsticks. I quite like those glue stick forms. We'll have a private glue conversation. But glue stuff, this is what we don't talk about. We talk about images, but we rarely talk about the stuff,
Absolutely.
the sticky, messy, uncontrollable stuff that holds it all together.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's really important.
Yeah.
Glue.
Yeah.
Both of us.
But then, please.
I just wanted to ask these two. Is there something about collage that remains slightly illicit, slightly naughty, slightly cheating? I know it has now a long and venerable history, but I'm convinced that part of the appeal is that it's something done in private that is then made public. There's something of that. That because no collagist wants to feel they belong to the long and venerable history of collage. There's always something. It has to feel like. On some, I don't know. I get the impression it has to feel like it's something that, on some level, you feel you shouldn't be doing.
No, I think you're right. Yeah. I mean, to cut an image,
You're getting away with it.
it is an offence. It is a violation,
Yeah.
and that violation is violent. Well, that's what that means. And in the end, I always feel that collage has to be a sort of reparation for that violence in some way. It has to redeem that act of violence. But it is strange you have to create the violence in the first place in order to somehow enter that particular relationship with the image.
I went into a bookshop recently because I was doing a series of photo montages, and I really wanted a natural history book from the approximately, I knew between 1920 and 1930, and I found this beautiful, huge encyclopedia. And the bookseller, got it down from the shelf. I happened to utter the dreaded word collage. And he just said, and he just snatched it back. He said, but you'll kill the book. And I was like, well. But my argument was that in a way you're liberating those images. Those images could remain on a bookshelf for another 100 years, and nobody would get pleasure from seeing them. So my argument was that I was, liberating them in some way. But he wouldn't sell it to me. He used to do that. So I had to go on A-books and find the same one. But no, it's a dramatic sort of, he wasn't, I was going to kill the book. So,
You both spoke of speed. And I think speed is a very interesting thing, especially and also in relation to movement, as you said. And for example, I know, John, that you're doing films as well, and your films are made of images. I believe that the process itself is also a process of digitization that does have some kind of relationship with that.
they are digital.
Yeah, but for those who don't know these films, well, maybe you're even more qualified to explain them than I do.
Oh, I don't know. I'm not
It's part
sure.
of the project so much.
Well, maybe I should be by now, yeah.
Yeah.
I never feel that I'm completely in control of what I'm doing in my work anyway. I mean, that's one of the I mean, I always feel that whenever I'm working on something, I always need one or two digressions to get lost from my original purpose. And the films actually were just a kind of hypothesis. Over the years, I've thought, what if you actually project 24 different frames per second from films? What if I actually animate this huge collection of film stills that I possess and I've built up over the years? What if I actually return those to the state from the stillness that I've been trying to redeem it from, back into the sort of purgatory or the hell of a succession of images, that is the media. But if I do that, what will happen? And I didn't know, so I called the film Blind, because you are blind to single images at that rate. You cannot take your brain cannot receive that many images, so you edit. And what emerged was a complete surprise to me, which was that everyone who looked at the films saw different films. And I, every time I went to see it, saw a different film. It was kind of magically a sort of cinema of discontinuity in a way, in which everyone chose to see whatever it was of thy recherche. And they're strangely hallucinatory. And I've just been pursuing various sort of ideas within them. And I thought they'd be a state of blind. It was kind of like an attempt to do the opposite of what my work was doing, sort of redeeming the image of visual. I had intended to make it disappear again. But it didn't. Actually, it created incredibly indelible images. They're just a mystery to me, really.
There's a great interest in film and in that relationship between film and collage, the photographic collage particularly, and that idea, as you said, of movement, of speed, of juxtaposing different images. And I guess I always wonder if there is a temptation there to cross to the other side and make film.
Have you made film?
No, I suppose I have, but mainly what happens, because making collage, photo montage is such a solitary, almost sickly occupation, I find at times, that my thoughts do turn towards performance, I suppose, rather than film. I turn towards performance. I think the last two ballets that I've created have come out of very much sort of looking at a certain range of imagery and beginning to, in those long laborious hours of cutting out shapes and positioning them, beginning to hear a soundtrack and imagining some of the figures that I have been cutting out, how they would move through space, whether that's a so-called glamour model or fashion model, etc. How would that person, how would they walk through a space? What would be the soundtrack? I mean, this is just coming through boredom again. It comes to cutting, because my cutting's far more intricate than yours. Jonathan and I will cut, take 2 hours to cut out a fuchsia or whatever. So in those 2 hours of careful cutting, there's much time for contemplation of the imagery that's around me. So I suppose I turn more often towards performance.
Yeah.
And within performance, trying to have those sort of cuts and juxtapositions, and then worked with musicians and fashion designers to also explore collage in those media too.
Well, it's interesting that moment you talked about in the 70s, because there is a corresponding expansion of collage filmmaking, working with found footage particularly.
Yeah.
And I think, I don't know what year it was, it's either 75 or 76, the best short film Oscar went to a collage movie called Frank Film by a guy called Frank Morris. It's completely forgotten these days, but it's a remarkable film, because he needed something like 17,000 separate cut-out pieces. I mean, they move around in these constant sort of fractal patterns while he narrates his life in a very deadpan way through this sort of endless pursuit. I mean, you could do it in a day, on Final Cut Pro. But that's the thrill of it, and when you're watching it, you know that it's got a couple of mistakes in it where things disappear and reappear and they shouldn't. But there's that sense of him having made it frame by frame, and he's only got one go at it, or it's going to go. It's going to go. It's quite an amazing thing.
I'll ask a question. One word I didn't hear is transformation. I mean, if collage isn't about transformation, I don't know what it's about. What I'm trying to say, I mean, are all collages equal, or are some more equal than others? That's my question. And images too.
I'm not answering that one, no.
What?
Pass it over here.
I'm transferring that. I don't deal with big questions like that.
Why not?
Oh, that's why I'm a collagist. It's just a little bit. I can only deal with detailed matters.
We're in a kind of art gallery here. Theoretically, there's something going on.
No, I leave these grand themes to curators.
Really? We're all equal. Everything is equal. It doesn't really matter.
I'm sure you're right.
No, I think you're absolutely right. I would be happy to talk about the big stuff, because that's why we're doing it anyway. And maybe the difficulty is that we make the work we make because we can't articulate
My
that
favorite
moment.
word is metamorphosis.
Yes, exactly.
Hmm?
But it's, I suppose, because artists often make work because they can't articulate that, so the answers are to be found within the work we make. But I know there's a very definite moment when putting images together, when that moment of transformation. And of course, that's like a drug. That's where you get your hit, because it's indescribable why moving two elements 3 millimeters and suddenly that transformation happens. I mean, I can't explain it away, but that's always what one's chasing, like some peculiar addict chasing that kind of transformative moment.
Well, Max Ernst thought of it as actually a form of alchemy.
Yes, yeah.
Did you say?
Yeah.
Alchemy. Max Ernst was obsessed with alchemy.
That's another hyperloop word.
Yes, exactly.
Well, if you've got
It is. You're redeeming, in a sense, something, the image from this purgatorial space of disappearance. So it is a kind of, there's a mythic process of transformation in that, in itself. And then to combine it with other images brings it into all sorts of other more complex combinatory worlds, I suppose. Yeah, I'm fascinated, obviously, by that process. I find I'm complicating the image rather than making it more transparent or purer. Purification of the process of alchemy is to create something that's somehow transparent and translucent. And I feel I'm taking something that's translucent and trying to
opaque.
So I'm collecting what the alchemists would call negrido, the dirt, the obscure stuff.
Yes. Can I raise a rather perverse point about collage made with mass-produced imagery? And that's that they could exist, there could be multiple copies of them in a sort of parallel universe. I know this because there's a piece by John from 1979 called The Voyeur, which, if I was ever banished to a desert island, that's one of the artworks I'd take with me. And it came up for sale, and it was way beyond my means. But I knew how to get hold of the film still that he'd used, and he'd only cut out a silhouette from it. So, at home, I have my own version of the Voyeur made from that still.
You've been keeping this
because that is a potential. That is in the genetic makeup of any artwork made in the era of mechanical reproduction. There could be another one somewhere else. Don't worry, John, it's not going anywhere.
I shall never trust you again.
It just keeps me happy to know that...
Anyway, don't ask me to sign it.
I'll ruin it, it's mine.
Guys, I've been sitting here next to an image which I think is kind of rather a brilliant example of transformation.
Yes.
And rather disturbing. And it consists of a film still with the postcard over it, and there's a woman sitting on a bed, and she's partly obscured by the picture postcard, and she's holding something up, and it looks as if they're the feet of a puppet.
That's exactly right, they are.
And the head and of both the puppet and the woman correspond to the top and bottom of a waterfall. But instead of the waterfall falling down, in other words, instead of it being gravity, the water is actually moving between the two heads. So in other words, you have a sort of extraordinary image whereby one's expectation, which is that water falls, the water instead is a sort of power moving between these two heads. So at one level it's very banal, because you think, well, that's upside down, the postcard isn't the right way up. So at one level it's a sort of banality, but at another level it's an extraordinary sort of like force. There's a sort of extraordinary power that we associate primitively with things like waterfalls, and that are domesticated in postcards. And that, in a sense, this is re-finding the primal force of water and our sense of fear and fascination.
Thank you very much. I mean, I saw the water as being almost like elastic, pulling between the mask of the mother. I took it as the mother, I don't know why. I said mother then, didn't I? But the woman and this doll, which actually, I'll tell you, was dressed as a sailor. When I do things, I do sometimes regret that. I wish I'd photographed it before. But then he's the light and she's the darkness somehow that's being pulled out from her somehow. I'd never turned one of its like before, and I think I might do it again. It just happened by accident, as all the best things do.
I think you just go crazy with the possibilities. I mean, you can make anything fit anything. So there's no pleasure there. There's no friction. There's no challenge. So when I work digitally, I work very quickly. I just pretend it's kind of digital scissors. And the glue. Sometimes I try to deconstruct or really pinpoint whether it's collage or photo montage. It's just the Stations of the Cross. And I suppose it's finding material. Then there's a selection of it. There's the cutting out, there's the arranging. And again, there's a certain sensuality there, just that sort of, rather like the cut, just that getting the sticky stuff out, I really enjoy.
And I don't know, the moment I touch the surface of digital print, I can't bear it. I've got a total phobia for it. And the virtual cut, well, actually, I'm not a great fan of collage. You might imagine I am. But it's actually, I'm a quite generous person aesthetically, but collage is my little blind spot. Not much of it I actually like, to be honest. And, it lends itself so much to that cut and paste in the digital era sense. And that's the association I really dislike with collage. I call it montage.
In 1976, when I first made the first collages, photo montages, John Addis' book called Photo Montage was published in 1976 by Thames and Hudson. For me, that was a really, really important moment. And it was only 2 years ago I finally met John Addis, and I could say to her, you gave birth to me in 1976. And she's like, I had no idea. And I said, well how could you? No, I didn't cut it off. It's still there, pristine. But I remember I bought it from a left-wing bookshop in Manchester, so there's lots of feminist titles, and suddenly you just had photo montage. And that became a sort of Bible, and a sort of, it enabled me to see a sort of lineage and aspire to take my place within that one day, I suppose. It was such an invaluable book, and the timing of it could not have been more perfect. Lots of people I know bought the book Photo Montage, even if they were making photo montage. So I think then I remember reading it thinking that's I'm signing up, that's what I do. When I met Dawn a couple of years ago, we talked a lot about collage, photo montage, and I went back to, because over the last decade or so, lots of museums, galleries, they hate the word photo montage. I think for the Hannah Hock exhibition, Dawn was not allowed to use the word photo montage. It had to be collage, in there.
But do you think, given that book came out then, if you think of the kind of heated politics of the art world, it's kind of obvious in a way that she calls it photo montage and not collage, or doesn't do a book about collage, which at the time, I get the impression, had more of a reputation of being decorative or whimsical or less.
That kind of post-60s sort of Victorian.
Which is not the kind of definition you would adhere to. But that was around, don't you think?
No, I thought the opposite really. But, I mean, I just remember, well, I mean, you know, collage comes out of Picasso, Braque, that generation, Cree, and so it comes out of painting. That's my understanding of collage. But there's a distinction between, I've always felt that, I mean, I did articulate it in the essay that I wrote many years ago that's in the catalogue there, about a distinction between montage and collage, which I suppose I kind of broadly still hold to. We sort of live, and increasingly, in a communication culture, which is a form of montage. I mean, everything, our encounter with imagery is seamlessly continuous with this process of media construction of events. And that's the world we inhabit predominantly, and our children inhabit even more extremely, it seems to me. And that is montage. And if you go back to montage as an idea, you go back to, say, Eisenstein. And Eisenstein began that sort of universal montage principle, in my view. He created Hollywood, and he created that kind of linear way of reading the image. And that's what montage is. It's a part of a grammar that reduces the image simply to a conduit, something somewhere else. Collage for me was a resistance to that. A kind of, instead of a seamlessness, creating a kind of something that exposed the fissures between images, and exposed the kind of the abyss behind images, the world of images, in some way. That it had a kind of a more abysmal prospect, you might say. The collage was interruptive. It stopped that speedy consumption by which images disappear. It brought the edges between worlds of meaning into connection in such a way as to annihilate one another and create somehow images out of communication. So collage to me was, I think increasingly, collage is now a kind of resistance, but more a kind of friction within the overall machine. And I don't know whether I'd even hold to the distinction anymore. I think it's becoming meaningless. You know? But anyway, I think that's what collage should be. Put it that way.
Please, have you ever thought that you were sometimes... Have you ever stopped yourself in the creative process when looking at a visual and thinking, this is beautiful, and if I do that, liberating it, as you said, would be ruining it, would be like taking it?
I know what you mean. It's that kind of aesthetic arrest sometimes. You're looking through whatever the magazine or book can be, that sense of... but that almost makes me more want to see how I can find an entry point into it. So I do that, and often they're the most sort of quite severe photo montage. That the beauty of this are really being obliterated by some foreign object being placed, foreign image being placed upon them.
I find it's a question of time. When I find an image which I like in a book, I can't bear to touch the book. It's sacred for a period of time. And it kind of gets displaced somewhere. And eventually, I can't resist the temptation. And then I feel really, really guilty. Then it's imperative that something emerges out of that to redeem the act of violence. Yeah. I don't know. It's a complicated issue.
There's a
Good question.
There's a really good line in the biography of Jean-Luc Godard that was written by Colin McCabe when Godard was 70. And McCabe is talking about the series of films that Godard made in the 80s when VHS was available. And that meant a big part of the history of cinema was available. And Godard put together 6-hour-long collages, really, called the Histoire du Cinéma, which was his own autobiographical, philosophical history of cinema, made entirely of fragments from existing films. And it's interesting that it was done on sort of domestic VHS, because it was suddenly that all that stuff was around. But McCabe says something very interesting. He says, and I can say it verbatim because it's so beautifully written. He said, in a world in which we're entertained from the cradle to the grave, whether we like it or not, the ability to rework image and dialogue is a matter of psychical and political health. That somehow, okay, let's say for a moment there are too many images. If you don't have your way with them, they will have their way with you. You know, that's a very sort of post-68 kind of way of thinking about it.
I really want to thank you three very, very much for coming and for taking the time, but also for taking part in the project in such a generous way. And thank you very much for everyone
And
for
Yuval,
coming.
thank you very much for the
Yuval,
show.
Yes, thank you.
Lastly, I do have to say one more thank you, which is a big one, and that's for the gallery, for Luxembourg and Diane, because really, in today's crazy gallery world, there are very few places who would take the time and the effort to conduct real research over long periods of time and to exhibit works that are not always there for sale and to really have a genuine conversation. And I urge you all, the publication accompanying this exhibition is not of the works in the show, but it's actually an anthology of approximately 20 essays from the history of the last century about collage. They're full length, including writings from theoreticians, artists, historians, and it's really a valuable reader that is nowhere to be found and otherwise requires a tremendous amount of work to pick and gather all these things. So, and you can find it in the back and look at it, and it's really great. So thank you,
Thank you.
Alma, Daniela.
Thank you.
Thank you.